Hello everybody, welcome to Midwest Imagery. We have been talking about the essential elements of photography. And understanding these essential elements are what's going to make us better photographers. Those three essential elements are understanding the exposure triangle, metering for exposure and setting the controls for the exposure, and understanding the rules of composition. And I've talked briefly about these in past episodes. But today I thought I would start with showing you some of the concepts that I've been talking about here on some images. And I like to start with our ISO control, because that's generally what I set first when I show up on a scene. Is I'll set my ISO. At high ISOs, even though our cameras have gotten much better at handling high ISO noise, there can be a noise introduced into the shots. However, having said that, I would much rather make the shot using a higher ISO than miss the shot completely. Give me a couple of minutes to get set up here and I will be right back. Okay, I'm back. So in this shot, we're seeing a low ISO image. I made this shot at ISO 100 and my aperture was at f22. This is an HDR shot. HDR is short for high dynamic range. What we see here is I'm metering on the sky. I'm metering in this area right up in here, the clouds. This gives me all this nice detail in the clouds. We're seeing all the early spring color. This is an example of shooting at low ISO. We have nice, clean tonalities. The colors look as you would expect them to look. We don't see any noise in this image. Here's another example of low ISO. Notice how we see this knife is in nice focus. This hand is in nice focus. We could see reflections and specular highlights on the hands from the grease. I made this shot at ISO 200 at an aperture of 5.6. Then the shutter speed was dialed in at 500th of a second, and I'll be metering on this area somewhere up in here in the brightest area of my scene. If we start talking about high ISO, now you can see that this picture was made at night under artificial lights. My ISO was at 5,000. In my pictures, I like a little bit of motion on the extremities of my action shots. Where we'll see noise in this picture is in the background area, on the buildings. The subject's face will be a little softer than it normally is, and I'll show you here. As we zoom in on this, we can see in the background all of this kind of splotchy, dotty looking color on the roof and on the sidewalls, even some in the window reflections. The subject's face is a little softer than it normally would be because of the ISO noise that's introduced. Here's another example of a high ISO shot. This one was made at ISO 3200. But we can see here that it's still pretty clean. In the close-up, we've got softness around the edges. We don't see a whole lot of noise in the image, except for around here and some of the little shadow details. The shutter speed determines the length of time that light strikes the sensor or the film. Shutter speed can freeze a moving object or increase the blurring and accentuate the feeling of motion. Here's a shot of a fast shutter speed. I'm at a thousandth of a second, 5.6, so that I have a very shallow depth of field, and my ISO is at 800. And I wanted to mostly stop the action of this bird in flight, but we still see that even at a thousandth of a second, part of its wing is still a little bit soft, and that doesn't bother me here. And here's an example of a slow shutter. I made this one late winter's night. My camera's on a tripod. This was with film, and it was a 15-minute exposure at f/22 because I want as long of an exposure as I can get. So if I choke my aperture down to f/22, it takes that much longer to get an exposure in here. And what we see here are all of these items starting to circumnavigate the scene. And go ahead and let me know what you think this is. I get a lot of guesses about what we're seeing in this image, so let me know what you think they are, and I'll tell you in just a minute. But before I get there, notice this tree in the foreground is brighter than the other ones around it because I'm using my little pen light as a paintbrush. And I'm painting a little light on here during the exposure so that it kind of gives it a little offset and helps to blend in with some of the colors of these stars. Yep, that's right, these are stars circling Polaris, the North Star, which would be up in this corner. Another example of a slow shutter. I made this shot in can't see your hands in front of your face darkness, and yet light coming from somewhere on this peak. Here's another slow shutter example. I'm 1.6 seconds at f/22 and ISO 100. It was late in the fall. I'm on a tripod, and I stopped my aperture down to f/22, so the shutter has to stay open longer. And as I'm keeping my ISO way low, that even increases the length of my shutter speed. Even so, in this light, I could only get 1.6 seconds. I liked where the water's coming over these rock formations, how we can see nice little wisps of water. And this turns nice and cloudy, smooths the water out here, but we still see movement and power and energy all the way out to the horizon line of the water, which then turns into a sky. Now the aperture, as we've talked about, determines how much light passes through the lens. The aperture size also controls our depth of field, which is the area from near to far in a scene that is acceptably sharp. This example of a shallow depth of field, I am 2.8, and that gives us a very shallow depth of field. You can actually see the area of focus on this grass here. It's going right through this area here. The face of this kit is in nice sharp focus, but the chest and the rest of all of the distracting elements in the background is minimized. We don't really see it because our shallow depth of field focuses our eye immediately on the subject here, which is this little baby. Another example of controlling the depth of field. Shallow depth of field, I'm looking up the trunk of this old white pine, and I'm focusing on this area right here, which is the only thing in focus. But we don't need anything else in focus here because our eye grabs this focus and immediately tells us that we're looking at the trunk of a big tree. Here's another shallow depth of field. My ISO is 320. I'm at f2.8 to totally isolate the subject in this shot, and my shutter speed is 1/1600 of a second. And notice how that 2.8 shallow depth of field just totally washes out any background details and any foreground details that might be distracting to us. Instead, it allows us to go right to the subject so that our eyes just go right to the subject. So I'm using this technique to guide your eye right into the shot to right where I want you to look at. It worked, didn't it? In portraits, shallow depth of field is always good. We're on a city street, but everything behind her is minimized, and it starts to serve as a background and framing instead of distracting. The foreground is good. I'm focusing on her eyes because 2.8 is a very shallow depth of field, and I want to make sure that her eyes are in focus in this shot here. 320 ISO, 2.8 aperture, a 400th of a second. Here's another example of shallow depth of field, what you can do with products, or the depth of field exercise in a previous episode. My ISO is at 1600, my aperture is 2.8, and I'm at 400th of a second. Focusing on this chair here, and then the farther away from this chair we go, it renders everything into just kind of specular highlights that helps our eye go right to the focus spot. Now when we're talking about deep depth of field, here's one I made on a top of a mountain at an ISO of 100, and I'm using an f8 for my aperture. f8 gives me a 500th of a second. I will be metering on the sky so that I can get all the detail in the clouds. I don't want anything to be blown out or pure white. And then we just see all these mountains. This little bit of the mountain in the foreground helps to kind of catch our eye so that we can look right into the rest of the image as well. This picture, I've got a couple of figures in the foreground for scale, but if we look way out into the distance, it's a very deep depth of field. Everything is in nice focus. We can see the curvature of the earth. I'm using 9.5 on my aperture, and my ISO is at 250, which gives me a 3/50th of a second. Another deep depth of field. I'm using an aperture of f22 and an ISO of 500, which gives me a 1/15th of a second. Now I am on a tripod here, and I'm using a 15th of a second because I don't want it to be any slower. I don't want this water here to be all smoothed out. I still want to see motion and action in the water coming through here, and a 15th of a second still allows a lot of that to work. In my mind, having the water completely smoothed out would have made it look quite unnatural. Now, in an earlier episode, I've shown you how to do this depth of field exercise. And here's an example done in the classroom of my 2.8 shot versus my f22 shot. And notice the difference. Here's the 2.8 again, where everything in the background is minimized. We don't really see it, but what we are looking at immediately is this center battery that's in focus. And then when we go to f22, we can see everything in the background. There's a keyboard and a monitor and a camera and a lens and a speaker and a mouse and desks and all sorts of stuff. So when we start to use our apertures to control the depth of field, we're also controlling what our viewers will see and what we want them to see. And that's all because we understand the exposure triangle. And again, the exposure triangle consists of the three exposure controls: the ISO, which is the sensor's sensitivity to light; the aperture, which is the opening in your lens that lets light come into your sensor and controls the depth of field; and our shutter speed, which determines how long the light coming in through the aperture reaches the sensor. Okay, so that's a few examples of what our shutter speed, our ISO, and our apertures can do for our pictures. And that's going to do it for me for today. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.